XYZ. A captured soldier is shoved into an American processing tent expecting torture, but is instead handed the exact same steaming meal the guards are eating. Confusion flips to fear. Is this kindness a trick, poison, or psychological warfare? Clean clothes, hot showers, real medics who stitch wounds and save lives. Little by little, what was taught as the enemy starts to make no sense. Then, an American doctor wheels into a field hospital and begins to operate on a prisoner who shot at him hours before. Men who believe their whole world are forced to choose between loyalty to a lie and the terrifying truth in front of them. If feeding and healing your supposed enemy can make you question everything, what would you do? Wei pressed his back against the cold concrete wall of the processing building, his hands trembling as American guards herded him forward. The propaganda had been clear. Americans skinned prisoners alive. They tore out fingernails. They experimented on captured soldiers like rats in a laboratory. He had seen the Soviet films. He knew what was coming. "Move along," the interpreter said in Mandarin, his tone oddly gentle. Wei shuffled forward with 200 other Chinese soldiers, all of them captured during the disastrous push across the 38th parallel 3 weeks earlier. They had marched for days, hands bound, expecting execution at any moment. Instead, they had been loaded onto boats and brought to this barren island. Geoje, the guards called it, a rock jutting out of the Yellow Sea covered in tents and barbed wire. The Americans had built an entire city of compounds here, and the rumors said it held over 170,000 prisoners. Wei couldn't comprehend that number. His entire division had been 12,000 men. The processing line moved him forward into a large tent. An American soldier, barely 20 years old with red hair and freckles, gestured toward a table. On it sat clothing. Prison uniforms, Wei assumed. Scratchy fabric designed to humiliate. He had been taught that capitalists viewed human life as disposable, but the clothes were clean, new even. The fabric felt thick, warm. "Change," the interpreter said. "Your old uniform will be washed and stored." Washed? Wei looked at his fellow prisoners, seeing the same confusion mirrored in their hollow faces. Why would the Americans bother washing the clothes of men they planned to torture? The next station brought more impossible.
Soldiers got sick, they either recovered or died. Medicine was reserved for officers. The final station was a shower. Hot water, actual hot water, poured from pipes overhead. Wei stood under the stream, feeling 2 years of dirt and blood and death wash away. He couldn't remember the last time he'd bathed in hot water, perhaps never. Then came the dining hall. Wei smelled it before he saw it, the unmistakable aroma of cooking meat. His stomach, which had sustained itself on millet and tree bark for months, twisted painfully. The Chinese officers had told them that surrender meant starvation, that Americans would feed prisoners just enough to keep them alive for interrogation, then let them waste away. But when the American guard handed Wei a metal tray through the serving line, he stared at it in complete disbelief. Rice! Real rice, steaming hot, more than he had seen in a single portion since before the war. Vegetables, carrots, beans, something green he didn't recognize. A piece of meat the size of his palm, with actual fat marbling through it. Bread, soft and white, and something the guard called coffee, black and bitter, but radiating warmth. Wei looked up at the American soldier serving food. The man wore the same uniform as the guards, the same boots, the same equipment, and on his tray, visible through the serving window, sat the exact same meal. The same meal! Wei's hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the tray. Around him, 200 Chinese soldiers stood frozen, staring at their food in complete silence. This had to be a trick. Some elaborate psychological torture the Soviets hadn't warned them about. They were being fattened up like pigs before slaughter. Or perhaps the food was poisoned, designed to kill them slowly while American doctors studied the effects. Nothing else made sense. Private Chen, who had bunked next to Wei during training, whispered in Mandarin, "It's a trap. They want us to lower our guard." But Wei's stomach overruled his brain. He sat at one of the long tables, actual tables with benches, and lifted a spoonful of rice to his lips. The taste exploded across his tongue. Real food, seasoned food.
More calories in this single meal than he had consumed in entire days during the winter.
Barbarism. About the superiority of the communist system that would inevitably triumph over the decadent West. He looked across the dining hall and saw American guards eating at their own tables. The same rice, the same meat, the same portions. They weren't eating better food while prisoners starved. They were sharing their rations equally with the enemy. Wei's political officer, Lieutenant Zhang, had been captured in the same battle. Zhang sat at the far end of Wei's table, and Wei watched his face cycle through confusion, anger, and something that looked like fear. Zhang had spent years teaching soldiers that Americans were devils, that capitalism meant exploitation, that workers in America lived like slaves. But slaves didn't share their food with captors. Slaves didn't receive medical care. Slaves didn't sleep in tents with real cots and blankets. That night, lying on an actual mattress for the first time in his life, Wei stared at the canvas ceiling and tried to reconcile reality with everything he had been taught. The cognitive dissonance made his head hurt worse than hunger ever had. Over the next weeks, the impossible became routine. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, all of them real meals with real portions. Wei's body, accustomed to perpetual starvation, began to change. His ribs stopped showing through his skin. His face filled out. He could feel his muscles recovering strength. He wasn't alone. Across Geoje, 170,000 communist prisoners were experiencing the same transformation. Men who had weighed 130 pounds upon capture were reaching 160, 170, 185. American doctors made rounds through the compounds every single day. When dysentery broke out in Compound 62, American medics quarantined the infected men and treated them with real medicine until the outbreak ended. When a prisoner developed appendicitis, American surgeons operated and saved his life. The statistics were impossible, but they were real. Wei heard the numbers whispered through the compounds. Less than 1% of prisoners died in American custody. 1%. In the Chinese camps holding American prisoners, more than a third died. More than a third. Wei had seen death. He had watched entire platoons freeze during the winter offensive because there were no warm clothes, no proper supplies, no food. He had seen friends die. Workers around the world. But Zhang's words carried less weight with every meal. How could you convince a man he was being exploited when he was eating better than he ever had in his life? How could you preach about capitalist cruelty when American doctors were saving prisoners from preventable deaths? The breaking point came in week 6, when Wei watched American guards and Chinese prisoners play basketball together on a court the Americans had built. There were rules, actual rules that applied to everyone equally. When an American guard fouled a Chinese prisoner, the referee called it, and the guard accepted the penalty without argument. In the People's Liberation Army, challenging an officer's decision meant punishment. Rank determined truth. Power superseded rules. But here, on this basketball court, merit mattered. Skill mattered. The rules applied to everyone the same way. Wei stood watching that game, and something fundamental shifted in his understanding of the world. He thought about the $250 billion America was spending on this war. A number so vast it was meaningless to a farmer's son from Sichuan. He thought about the American industrial capacity that could feed and house 170,000 prisoners while simultaneously fighting a war. He thought about the fact that America chose to spend $3.50 per day, per prisoner, per day, keeping enemy soldiers fed and healthy. Not because they had to, because they believed it was right. That night, Lieutenant Zhang called another self-criticism session. But when he began his usual lecture about capitalist exploitation, Private Chen stood up. "They feed us better than our own army did," Chen said quietly. "They treat our wounded. They don't beat us. They share their rations equally. Everything you taught us was a lie." Zhang's face went purple. He started to shout, to threaten Chen with consequences when they returned to China. But his voice faltered when he looked around the room and saw 60 men nodding in agreement. The political officer's authority, built on years of indoctrination and fear, crumbled in that moment. Because you cannot convince a starving man that abundance is oppression.
You cannot convince a dying man that medicine is exploitation. You cannot convince prisoners that kindness is cruelty. The Americans had won a victory without firing a shot, without dropping a single bomb. They had simply treated for freedom. Zhou Lin didn't know the American doctor's name. He didn't know that the man standing over him had 3 children back in Ohio, or that his shoulder still bled through the bandages from Zhou's bullet. All Zhou knew was pain, the kind that meant he was dying. The field hospital tent at Geoje held 40 beds crammed with wounded prisoners. Zhou had taken shrapnel from a mortar round during a breakout attempt 3 days earlier. Metal fragments had torn through his abdomen. His own Chinese medical officer had looked at the wounds and walked away. "Save the medicine for soldiers who can fight again," he'd said. Then the Americans came. Captain Ralph Blumberg walked into that tent with his right arm in a sling. The bullet wound in his shoulder was 4 hours old. Zhou had fired that shot during the firefight that led to his capture. The irony wasn't lost on either man when the interpreter explained the situation. "Tell him I'm going to operate," Blumberg said, his good hand already scrubbing for surgery. The interpreter, a Korean civilian, hesitated. "Sir, this is the man who shot you." "I know who he is. Tell him I'm going to save his life." Blumberg operated for 7 hours with one functional arm. He removed 14 metal fragments from Zhou's intestines, repaired 2 perforations, and stopped internal bleeding that should have killed the Chinese soldier hours earlier. When Zhou woke up 36 hours later, the first thing he saw was his enemy checking his bandages and smiling. "The surgery went well," Blumberg said through the interpreter. "You're going to live." Zhou Lin would later write, "That's when I understood that I had been fighting for the wrong side." This wasn't an isolated incident. It was American policy. The medical statistics from Korea's POW camps defy belief. The United States dedicated 542 doctors and over 2,000 medics exclusively to enemy prisoner care. They performed 6,847 major surgeries on communist soldiers in 1951 and 1952. They treated everything from combat wounds to tuberculosis to appendicitis, with the same equipment and medicine used on American troops. The cost? Approximately $42 per prisoner per day in modern dollars, just for medical care. America was spending more to keep enemy soldiers healthy than most countries spent on their own troops. Major William Anderson ran the surgical, watched American surgeons work with equipment he'd never seen in his country's best hospitals. They had portable X-ray machines, Kim later testified. Antibiotics in quantities I couldn't imagine. They performed surgeries that our best hospitals in the capital couldn't attempt, and they used all of it on us, their prisoners. The contrast was obscene. American POWs in Chinese camps died from infected cuts because basic antibiotics didn't exist. They died from appendicitis because there were no surgeons. They died from pneumonia because there was no medicine. But in American camps, communist soldiers survived wounds that would have killed them in their own army hospitals. Private First Class James Murphy from Tennessee described it. "We'd get these Chinese boys shot to hell, and our docs would work on them like they were Marines. I saw a surgeon spend 8 hours reconstructing a North Korean kid's shattered leg when amputation would have been easier. When I asked why, the doc said, 'Because we're Americans, and this is what we do.'" The medical buildings at Geoje held 3,200 beds, more hospital capacity than existed in all of North Korea. The Americans had built operating theaters with proper sterilization equipment, recovery wards with actual mattresses, and isolation units for infectious diseases. The supplies were staggering. Monthly requisitions for POW medical care included 50,000 units of penicillin, 30,000 sulfa tablets, 12,000 surgical dressings, 2,400 units of blood plasma, 800 pounds of surgical instruments. All of this for enemy soldiers. Sergeant Chen Wei-dong, the same soldier who'd been confused by the equal meals, found himself in the hospital with pneumonia in November 1951. American doctors treated him with penicillin, a drug he'd never heard of. Within 4 days, he was breathing normally again. "In the Chinese army, I would have died," Chen wrote. "Pneumonia killed half the soldiers in my unit the previous winter, but the Americans gave me medicine that cost more than a month of my salary back home. They gave it to me for free. They gave it to all of us." The psychiatric care was equally unprecedented. America assigned mental health specialists to POW camps, something no other nation had ever done. They treated combat trauma, depression, and the psychological effects of communist indoctrination. Lieutenant Colonel James treated their minds as worth saving. The North Korean medics watched all of this with growing horror. Not horror at American cruelty, but horror at what it revealed about their own system. Captain Kim Sung-ho kept detailed notes. "Every day I see my country's lies exposed," he wrote in December 1951. "We were told America was collapsing from economic crisis, yet they spend more on our medical care than our government spends on its entire army. We were told Americans were barbarians, yet their doctors work 20-hour shifts to save our men. We were told capitalism was dying, yet they have medicines we've never seen and equipment we couldn't build." Kim's notes eventually reached other prisoners through the camp's underground communication network. The impact was devastating to communist morale. If American propaganda was lies, then maybe everything else was too. The breaking point came in February 1952. A massive outbreak of typhoid threatened to kill thousands of prisoners. The disease spread rapidly through the crowded compounds, despite American sanitation efforts. The U.S. military's response was immediate and overwhelming. They flew in 50,000 doses of typhoid vaccine from Japan within 48 hours. Every single prisoner in every compound received vaccination. The Americans vaccinated 170,000 enemy soldiers in 6 days. The epidemic was stopped cold. Total deaths, 37, all among prisoners who had been infected before the vaccination campaign began. Lieutenant Zhang, the same communist political officer who'd been lecturing about capitalist traps, found himself in the vaccination line. He watched American medics work 16-hour shifts, jabbing needles into prisoner after prisoner, saving thousands of communist lives. "How do I explain this?" Zhang muttered to another officer. "How do I tell them this is capitalist exploitation when the capitalists just saved all of our lives?" He couldn't, and he didn't. Zhang's influence among the prisoners was finished. You can't preach about American barbarism while American doctors are saving your life. The wounded soldiers told their compound mates what they'd seen. Chinese prisoners who'd been in American operating rooms described equipment their own country didn't have. North Korean medics explained that they'd watched surgical techniques they'd never learned. The message spread through all 170,000 prisoners. Whatever we've been told about America is wrong. Effective propaganda tool in Korea. Except it wasn't propaganda. It was just Americans being Americans. Dr. Blumberg and Joe Lin's story became legend in the camp. Prisoners told and retold it. The American doctor who operated on the enemy who shot him. Joe himself became a living symbol of American values. He recovered fully, gaining 40 pounds in American care. He learned to read and write in the camp school. And when the choice came, Joe chose Taiwan over communist China, knowing he'd never see his family again. "Dr. Blumberg gave me more than my life," Joe wrote years later. "He gave me the proof that everything I'd been taught was a lie. No communist doctor would have saved an enemy who shot him, but an American did, because Americans see the humanity in everyone, even their enemies." Joe and Blumberg stayed in contact for 52 years, until Blumberg's death in 2003. Joe became a chemistry professor in Taiwan and eventually the United States. He spent his life telling students what American medical care in a POW camp had taught him about freedom. The hospital wards at Geoje became more than treatment centers. They became the front lines of an ideological war America was winning without firing a shot. Every surgery saved a potential convert. Every prescription filled planted a seed of doubt. Every kind word from an American medic watered that seed until it grew into full-fledged rejection of communism. The captured North Korean medics knew their cause was hopeless. They'd seen American abundance firsthand. They'd watched American doctors treat enemy soldiers with care that exceeded anything in Pyongyang's best hospitals. They understood that no propaganda could compete with the reality they'd witnessed. Captain Kim Sung-ho made his choice in May 1952. He refused repatriation and defected to the South. "I cannot go back and lie to my people," he told his screeners. "I've seen what America can do. I've seen how they treat even their enemies with dignity. I want to live in a world that builds hospitals for prisoners instead of gulags. America wasn't just healing bodies, it was winning the ideological war by saving lives. The compound's loudspeaker crackled to life at 0800 hours. Lieutenant Thomas Hayes, a former high school teacher from Nebraska, stood beside the interpreter with a baseball bat in one hand and a canvas bag of a
16-team baseball league with over 3,000 participating prisoners. The numbers tell an impossible story. American guards spent approximately 4,000 man-hours constructing baseball diamonds on an island that had been barren rock 18 months earlier. They imported 847 baseball gloves, 312 bats, and 1,200 baseballs, more sporting equipment than many American high schools possessed. Former Chinese soldier Liu Chang later wrote, "The first time I stood at home plate, I didn't understand the purpose. Our instructor, Sergeant Morrison, pitched the ball. I swung and missed 3 times. He didn't laugh. He showed me how to hold the bat, how to watch the ball, how to swing level. When I finally hit one into the outfield and ran to first base, my teammates, men I'd fought beside at the chosen reservoir, cheered like I'd captured an enemy position." But here's what shattered Liu's worldview. In the 6th inning, I was umpire. A dispute arose. Did the runner reach base before the tag? Both teams looked to me. I called him out, even though he was from my company. Nobody argued. The American guards nodded approval. That's when I understood. In baseball, the rules apply equally to everyone. There's no bribing the umpire, no using political connections to change the call. You win by being better, not by having the right family background. This was revolutionary thinking to men raised under totalitarianism. Master Sergeant James Morrison ran the compound's education program alongside the baseball league. His statistics should make every American proud. By the summer of 1953, more than 12,000 communist prisoners had learned to read and write in American-run programs. Another 3,000 completed high school equivalency courses. 200 prisoners were taking college-level classes by correspondence. Morrison kept detailed records. In Compound 76 alone, he documented 847 prisoners who had been completely illiterate upon arrival. Within 6 months, 783 of them could read at a 5th grade level. Within a year, 412 were reading Shakespeare, Lincoln's speeches, and the Declaration of Independence. These men were starving for knowledge. Morrison recalled in a 1987 interview. They'd study by candlelight long after lights out. They taught each other. I'd see North Korean farmers helping Chinese factory workers with algebra. Former enemy soldiers sharing text because the Geneva Conventions require it. Captain Hayes shook his head. The Geneva Conventions are rules. But why do we follow rules when no one is watching? Why do we spend money on enemy soldiers when that money could buy bullets? The question hung in the air. Then Hayes explained the American concept, that every human being possesses inherent dignity, regardless of nationality or political system. That rights don't come from government. They exist naturally. And government's job is to protect them. Chen continued. I raised my hand and said, but our officers taught us that rights are granted by the state, by the Communist Party, as rewards for service. Captain Hayes smiled sadly. If the state grants rights, the state can take them away. That's not rights. That's permissions. Americans believe you're born with rights simply because you're human. That single conversation changed Chen's life. He refused repatriation and eventually became a professor of political science in Taiwan, teaching thousands of students about the difference between totalitarianism and freedom. The education program's impact went beyond individual conversions. By May 1952, American officials noticed something remarkable. Prisoners were requesting books faster than supplies could arrive. The camp library, which started with 200 volumes in English and Chinese, expanded to 4,300 books by war's end. Circulation records showed 127,000 checkouts, an average of nearly 1 book per prisoner per week. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, who oversaw the program, reported to his superiors, "The prisoners are discovering that everything they were taught about the West was false." One North Korean sergeant told me, "We were told Americans were illiterate factory slaves.
But you have libraries in your prison camps. You teach your enemies to read. This does not match what we learned. The communist political officers recognized the existential threat. Lieutenant Zhang attempted to ban attendance at American classes, declaring them capitalist brainwashing. His order lasted 3 days before his own men ignored it. Over 200 prisoners from his compound attended classes anyway. When Zhang confronted them, a former corporal named Jin replied, "You can't stop us from learning. That's what makes them different from us." Zhang's authority wasn't ashamed. He smiled and said, "Good game." In my country, losing to prisoners would mean punishment. Here, it meant the game was fair. The combination of education and recreation had a measurable effect on repatriation choices. Of the 3,000 prisoners who participated in baseball leagues, 91% later refused to return home. Of the 12,000 who completed literacy programs, 87% chose freedom over repatriation. These numbers terrified communist leadership in Pyongyang and Beijing. By early 1952, something unprecedented was happening. Prisoners were voluntarily organizing study groups to discuss American government, economics, and philosophy. Former North Korean officer Captain Kim Sung-ho, the medic who defected after witnessing American medical care, became an informal teacher. He gave lectures comparing communist theory with American practice, using his own experience as evidence. Kim later testified, "I told them about the hospital where Americans saved my life using equipment our capital didn't possess. I told them about the baseball diamond built on an island while we were at war. I asked them, which system produces such abundance that it can afford to be generous to its enemies? They knew the answer. They'd been living it for months. The prison compounds became universities of freedom, and the communist world was about to discover just how many converts had been made. In April 1952, the United Nations Command prepared for voluntary repatriation screenings. Communist negotiators at Panmunjom assumed virtually all prisoners would choose to return home. After all, refusing repatriation meant treason, which carried the death penalty for the soldier and often his entire family. The screening team set up interview tents. Each prisoner would be asked privately, with no political officers present, "Do you wish to return to your homeland, or do you choose to remain in UN custody?" Captain Edward Lilly conducted over 800 interviews personally. He recorded them in detailed logs that still exist in the National Archives. "The first prisoner I interviewed had been in the literacy program," Lilly recalled. "He was a former farmer who'd learned to read English. He looked me in the eye and said, 'I cannot go back. They will kill me for knowing how Americans really live, for knowing that everything we were taught was lies. I would rather die here free than return to slavery.' Unlearn this. I cannot pretend I don't know that another way exists. Forgive me." The communist negotiators were stunned. Stalin reportedly flew into a rage when informed. Mao was humiliated before the world. How had the Americans turned loyal communist soldiers against their homelands? The answer was written in the education records, the baseball statistics, the medical files, and the meal logs. America hadn't broken these men through torture or brainwashing. They'd simply shown them the truth and let them choose. Lieutenant Zhang, the political officer who'd lost all authority, chose Taiwan. In his screening interview, he said, "I spent 20 years teaching communist ideology. It took 6 months in this camp to realize I'd been teaching lies." The mass refusals triggered a crisis that would extend the Korean War by 18 months and prove that America's greatest weapon wasn't its bombs or tanks. It was its unwavering commitment to human dignity, even for its enemies. An American captain sat across from a North Korean prisoner in a canvas tent on Geoje, a clipboard in his hands and sweat on his brow despite the April chill. The prisoner had arrived 6 months earlier, unable to write his own name. Now he spoke in broken but clear English. "I cannot go back," the man said, his hands trembling. "They will kill me for knowing how Americans really live, for knowing that everything we were taught was lies. I would rather die here free than return to slavery." Captain Edward Lilly had conducted 847 screening interviews in the past 3 weeks. This was the 623rd prisoner who had refused repatriation. The April 1952 voluntary repatriation screenings were supposed to be a formality. The communist negotiators at Panmunjom expected virtually all 170,000 prisoners to choose to go home. After all, refusing repatriation was treason. Communist doctrine taught that every loyal soldier would gladly return to continue the revolution. Political officers inside the camps had assured Beijing and Pyongyang that American tricks hadn't worked, that the men remained true believers. They were catastrophically wrong. The final numbers hit communist headquarters like an artillery barrage. Only 70,000 of 170,000 prisoners wanted to go home. 14,200 Chinese soldiers chose Taiwan over returning to screening. I was taught Americans were devils, but devils don't share their food. Devils don't heal your wounds with the same medicine they use on themselves. Devils don't teach you to read. I know now who the real devils are. Liu Cheng, the Chinese soldier who had learned baseball and umpired games between prisoners and guards, told his interviewer, "In my country, the rules change depending on who you are. Here, the rules are the same for everyone. I cannot go back to a place where truth itself bends to serve the powerful." The mass refusals created an impossible diplomatic crisis. The Korean War armistice talks, which had been progressing toward a conclusion, ground to a complete halt. The communist negotiators demanded forcible repatriation. Every single prisoner must be returned, regardless of their wishes. They called it a matter of principle. It was actually about survival. If 100,000 men could publicly reject communism after experiencing American values for just months, what did that say about the supposed superiority of their system? The propaganda value to the United States was incalculable. Every refugee from communism was a living, breathing indictment of everything Moscow and Beijing claimed. President Harry Truman faced an agonizing choice. He could agree to forcible repatriation and end the war immediately, bringing American boys home. Or he could refuse and accept that the war would continue indefinitely, with thousands more casualties over the fate of enemy soldiers. Truman never wavered. "We will not buy peace with the blood of these men who chose freedom," he declared in a cabinet meeting. To force them back would be to betray everything America stands for. General Mark Clark, the United Nations commander in Korea, was even more blunt in his communications to the communist negotiators. "We will not buy peace at the expense of delivering men back to slavery and death. These men have made their choice. We will honor it." The communists couldn't comprehend it. From their worldview, no nation would extend a war to protect enemy soldiers. It made no strategic sense. The American negotiators must be bluffing, using the prisoners as leverage for other concessions. But America wasn't bluffing. The war dragged on for 18 more months, from April 1952 to July 1953. During that time, 12,000 more Americans were killed and stopped wearing his party insignia in May 1952. By June, he was attending American history classes. During his own repatriation screening, he chose Taiwan, telling his interviewer, "I spent 6 months trying to keep these men loyal to communism. Then I realized I was the one who had been deceived. Everything I taught them was a lie." Captain Kim Sung-ho, the North Korean medic who had defected after seeing American hospitals, helped conduct screenings and reported that the men who refused repatriation weren't confused or coerced. They were the most educated, most thoughtful prisoners, the ones who had taken full advantage of American generosity to learn and think for themselves. "The ones going back are the ones who learned nothing," Kim reported to his American supervisors. "The ones staying understand what they're giving up. They know they'll never see their families again. They're making that choice because they've seen what freedom looks like, and they cannot unknow it." The screenings revealed gut-wrenching stories. A Chinese soldier named Wang chose Taiwan even though his wife had just given birth to their first child, a son he would never meet. "My son will grow up under communism," Wang said through tears. "But maybe someday, when China is free, he will understand why his father made this choice." A North Korean farmer who had been conscripted at age 38 refused repatriation despite having 4 children at home. "If I go back, I will teach my children to love the great leader and hate freedom," he explained. "If I stay, at least I will not spread that poison." Maybe it is the only good thing I can do for them. The American officers conducting these interviews were often moved to tears themselves. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who oversaw psychiatric services and had helped treat 4,000 prisoners for trauma and indoctrination damage, wrote in his personal journal, "These men are making a sacrifice I cannot fully comprehend. They are giving up everything, family, homeland, language, culture, for an idea they learned about in a prison camp. God help me. I hope America is worthy of their faith." The communist negotiators at Panmunjom tried everything. They accused America of torturing prisoners into refusing repatriation. They claimed the screenings were rigged. They demanded that neutral observers conduct new interviews. "Fine," said the Americans, "let's do it." In June 1952, neutral observers from to a place where thinking is forbidden. The communist response was to reject the neutral observers' findings and accuse them of being American puppets. By late 1952, the stalemate was complete. Thousands of men were dying in frozen trenches over a principle. Communist forces launched major offensives trying to break the deadlock. American artillery fired 2.4 million rounds in a single month trying to force concessions. Neither side budged. On the communist side, the refusal to accept voluntary repatriation was about maintaining the facade of ideological superiority. If they acknowledged that their own soldiers would choose capitalism over communism when given a real choice, the entire foundation of their system was exposed as hollow. On the American side, the principle was equally absolute. The United States had spent 2 years demonstrating to these prisoners that American values were real, that human dignity mattered, that individuals had worth beyond their service to the state. To then forcibly return them to slavery would be to admit that those values were just propaganda after all, no more real than communist promises. Master Sergeant James Morrison, who had run education programs and watched illiterate prisoners become scholars, put it plainly in a letter home. "We taught these men that they have inalienable rights that no government can take away. If we force them back to communist nations, we are teaching them that we lied, that rights only exist when they're convenient. I would rather fight another year than teach that lesson." The breakthrough finally came in March 1953, after Stalin's death. The new Soviet leadership, desperate to reduce military spending and international tensions, pressured China and North Korea to accept a compromise. Prisoners would be allowed to refuse repatriation, but they would be held by a neutral nation for 90 days, during which communist representatives could try to persuade them to return. It was a face-saving gesture. Everyone knew what would happen. The 90-day persuasion period was a disaster for the communists. The Chinese and North Korean representatives who came to argue for repatriation found themselves facing educated, articulate prisoners who debated them using facts and logic. Prisoners who had learned American history cited the states. The communist world never recovered from the humiliation. The Korean War prisoner defections became a permanent propaganda problem. How could they claim their system was superior when their own soldiers fled it at the first opportunity? How could they argue that Western democracies were inferior when soldiers chose freedom over returning to communist regimes?